In vanilla WoW, there were a few items which had negative stats on them. Most of the time, the negative stats was just stamina, but a few of them gave negatives in other things as well. In this video, we'll talk about negative stats on items, why they existed in vanilla, and why they didn't continue this trend going forward. Now, the biggest reason why vanilla WoW had negative stats on items is because that was a classic RPG trope. It was very common for RPG games and fantasy stories to have corrupted or cursed items, which gave you powerful bonuses at some kind of drawback, with the most iconic one probably being the Ring of Power from The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, the One Ring gave you the ability to go invisible, but at the cost of slowly driving you mad, and a whole bunch of other negative side effects and benefits as well. So, negative stats on items, in which there is already negative effects on some powerful abilities, just made sense. Like, for example, the vanilla item Skull of Impending Doom. It was an offhand weapon that increased your run speed by 60% for 10 seconds, but at the cost of draining your health and mana while active. An item with a powerful effect that had a downside to it. So items with negative stats just seem like the natural conclusion to this fantasy trope. Like, for example, the Shriveled Heart. It's a neck item which gives 13 stamina, but at the cost of -5 spirit and strength. If you're playing a class which doesn't need those two stats, that could be a decent stamina boost. Although that's not really a good example. You might be more familiar with the most famous item that had negative stats, known as the Corrupted Ashbringer. This item completely fits the trope of powerful items at a cost. The Ashbringer was one of the strongest weapons in the game, had a good on-use effect, and some extra effects out in the open world. Scarlet Crusade members would see you as friendly, all at the cost of -25 stamina on the weapon. And since this weapon was removed with the Wrath of the Lich King, it's one of the rarest weapons in the game. Other MMOs at the time also had gear with negative stats on them, including EverQuest, so no one really batted an eye at them at the time. But there might have been another reason why gear with negative stats existed. In the WoW Diary book, one of the vanilla WoW developers talks about how they had a philosophy of adding intentionally bad items to the game in order to make good items look much better in comparison. A very common practice done in card games to give the very strong cards better value when compared to all the intentionally bad cards. But it's not really something that happens very often in RPG video games. The book also talks about how they didn't really embrace this philosophy fully and just kind of dropped it eventually. So that could be a factor in why gear with negative stats existed, but it's much more likely the gear was just a homage to the corrupted or cursed item trope, which is very prevalent in RPG fantasy games, books, and movies. And if you take a look at items which have negative stats on them, this is a very easy conclusion to come to. So let's go over basically all of the negative stat items. For one, you have the Corrupted Ashbringer, which is pretty obvious. Even the Shriveled Heart could be seen as a cursed item, as you're gaining stats from someone else's body parts, which is taboo. The Ring of Scorn gave -3 spirit, and was a reward item from getting revenge on the guy who killed a Forsaken's wife. The Doomsayer's Robes had -10 stamina, and was a reward from the first part of the quest chain which ultimately rewarded the Skull of Impending Doom, an item I talked about earlier which drained your health and mana in order to run faster. Which thematically fits, as of course the Doomsayer Robes would give you negative stats as the whole quest chain was about getting a cursed item. The Cursed Eye of Paleth was an offhand item which gave -3 stamina, and has cursed in its name, and is a reward from a quest chain that has to do with finding a cursed item. Corruption, a sword which gave -40 spirit, with corruption in its name. Cloak of Rot, which gave -5 stamina, and has rot in its name. The Black Widow Band was a ring item that gave negative stats for stamina, which is just a drop from a spider, and thematically, could easily be reason that you're gaining the +7 intellect at the cost of some of your health from like a spider bite or something. The Cowl of Necromancy is kind of in the similar vein, in that it has -4 stamina, but gives you 15 intellect on a level 31 item, and is related to necromancy, which is usually a dark art in most RPG games, including World of Warcraft. So as you can see, nearly all of the negative stat items are related to cursed, dark magic, or taboo items. So thematically, it makes sense why they all had negative stats. Of course, there were also a few negative stat items that didn't really fit this trope, like the Fletcher's Gloves, which were just a leatherworking crafted item that had -1% parry chance, but gave you an increased 1% crit chance with missile weapons, which was later changed to negative stamina stat instead of a negative parry chance. Although these gloves do kind of make sense thematically as well. giving up some of your defenses in order to have better attack power. But after Vanilla WoW, there were no more negative stat items added to the game, and then all of the negative stat items were removed in Cataclysm with the Old World revamp. So why didn't Blizzard continue the trend of cursed or corrupted items with negative stats? The answer to that is basically just how they did stats in Vanilla WoW in general. Stats in Vanilla WoW were completely different to how they were in, say, the Burning Crusade. Items didn't have haste rating, crit rating, dodge rating. Items would just straight up give you a 1% chance to crit, a 1% chance to dodge, a 1% chance to hit, etc. It was in the Burning Crusade that they added the rating stat, which would add up to then give you maybe 1% chance to dodge or crit, once you got to an appropriate amount of that stat. Also, stamina used to be budgeted into an item's stats, along with all of the attack power increasing abilities. Today, stamina is just on pieces of gear alongside armor and your main stat boosts as your primary stats. And then a piece of gear will budget out your secondary stats, unrelated to the primaries. But in Vanilla WoW, there were no primary stats, and all of the stats were budgeted together, except for armor. So if something had stamina on it, that means it had less damaging stats, or healing stats, than a similar level piece of gear that didn't have stamina on it, as it was taking away some of that gear's budgeted stats for that stamina. So, some DPS classes could bring a set of glass cannon gear with no stamina on it that did a lot more damage. But with how raids and dungeons worked back then, that wasn't a good idea, as it meant you would die more often as well. And then there was a whole bunch of other secondary stats that don't even exist today. And that's how you have an environment in which negative stats were acceptable. Once stats started to be more streamlined and less random, where pieces of gear had main stats and then budgeted secondary stats, negative stats don't really fit into that format of gear. So if they wanted to add an item that had some kind of negative effect, it would just be added to a special weapon or item, like the trinket Whispers in the Dark, which was a haste trinket that gave you a really good haste proc for 12 seconds, but at the downside of after that proc ended, it would then decrease your haste for 8 seconds. And this trinket was released not too long ago in Legion, as it was a drop from Gul'dan in the Nighthold. So Blizzard is still willing to put out items that have negative effects. They've just kind of moved away from putting negative stats directly on pieces of equipment. And that's why negative stats was only a vanilla thing, and will most likely stay a vanilla thing.